mass shooter in Buffalo, New York. This was the one. He shot up a black grocery store. He had a GoPro camera. He had his markings all over his guns, racial slurs all over his guns, and it really looked a lot like the Christchurch, New Zealand mosque shooting. So those guys are really gearing up for accelerationism. And we know that because the shooter's name was Peyton Gendron, and he wrote a manifesto, and the manifesto is like, I'm an accelerationist. Here's what I believe. But these manifestos, they don't make it into the news cycle, right? They're going to focus on what kind of gun did he use? What kind of people did he target? Which are important in their own right. But at the same time, he's got a manifesto telling you that he actually did this because he wants to incite fighting over gun control, censorship, race relations. This is something that's called militant accelerationism. It's a specific type of accelerationism. And basically, it's a trend in terrorism where it emphasizes these leaderless movements and these decentralized terrorist networks to go and attack and cause chaos. And the end goal is to collapse the country, to collapse the United States. So they're trying to accelerate the collapse of the United States. And they do this by committing terror attacks, mass shootings, attacks on infrastructure, shooting up power substations, even things like infiltrating crowds and trying to provoke them to violence. Those are all things that accelerationists would condone doing. And so, yeah, it's definitely a really nuanced topic, but it's important to remember that what they rely on is the conflict and the division between the right and the left wing. And, they want to cause infighting. They want to make people fight. So if they can go, to a peaceful protest and provoke people, they're going to do that, right? Because it's going to make people mad. And the whole idea is to just divide our country and cause chaos and, hopefully kind of lead towards this societal collapse fantasy that they have.
So that's not one. Is that a specific person? Is that a specific group that is orchestrating it, or is it just kind of this mind virus type movement that has been created, and how organic is it?
Accelerationism is like a parasite. It's a concept, really. It's a set of strategies and tactics that can be used by anybody, really. It's just mostly been adopted by these leaderless terrorist networks. And so I think that it has spread kind of like a mind virus, right? Because it's really an advanced form of stochastic terrorism, where you think about, in this sense, we mean putting out propaganda and trying to infiltrate various different terrorism communities and trying to provoke those people towards violence. And so what's really happening is you have like a white nationalist network of people, right? They're white nationalists, but maybe they're not hurting anybody. Most of them aren't violent. They're just not white nationalists, right? You have these people who kind of infiltrate these movements, and they're trying to provoke them to violence, and they know it's going to destroy this cell in the process because it's going to turn them into terrorists, right? It's going to get all the law enforcement pressure on them and everything else. But they're very focused on infiltrating various communities of ideologies and trying to basically hone in on the most vulnerable person and try to provoke that person to violence. So they'll go into these movements and they'll try to find people who they can provoke and incite to go do something that will ultimately benefit accelerationist causes.
So what are some examples, before we kind of get into the full story, what are some examples of maybe some real world examples of the accelerationism?
Yeah, so so there have been several mass shootings. You watched part 4 of my video series, obviously, so you heard the story of how we linked the mass shooter in Buffalo, New York. This was the one. He shot up a black grocery store. He had a GoPro camera. He had his markings all over his guns, racial slurs all over his guns, and it really looked a lot like the Christchurch, New Zealand mosque shooting. So those guys are really gearing up for accelerationism. And we know that because the shooter's name was Peyton Gendron, and he wrote a manifesto, and the manifesto is like, I'm an accelerationist. Here's what I believe. But these manifestos, they don't make it into the news cycle, right? They're going to focus on what kind of gun did he use? What kind of what kind of people did he target, which are important in their own right. But at the same time, he's got a manifesto telling you that he actually did this because he wants to incite fighting over gun control, censorship, race relations. And he's basically just like taunting us in this manifesto because he knows the media isn't going to cover it. They're just going to spin it whatever political way they can. And that's the point, right? The point is to cause people to fight over gun control, censorship, race relations, things like that.
What do you think is the percentage of these mass shootings that are linked to maybe some of these subculture organizations versus really just the person acting out?
It's a mixed bag. I'm not going to say that every mass shooting is based in accelerationism, although every mass shooting can be exploited towards an accelerationist cause, right? Like I've noticed that recently there's this 4chan kind of meme that goes around, which in the past, they'd put like the Sam Hyde meme and they'd be like, well, why did Sam Hyde do this again? And it was a joke, but people would fall for it every time and they'd release a picture of him as a shooter. And 4chan has a good laugh at it. Now, 4chan's doing this thing where they make a picture of the shooter as a trans person and then try to put that out there. And every time people are falling for these like 4chan memes. And that's an example of like how they try to kind of exploit a mass shooting after the fact, regardless of whether it was an accelerationist motivated or not. Although I'd say that the ones that are definitely motivated by accelerationism, most of those guys have manifestos, they have gear, they're live streaming. Anytime you hear anything about a GoPro live streaming, that's a pretty big indicator. Because again, a big tenet of this philosophy is stochastic terrorism. This idea that you can inspire other attackers by, broadcasting, you're shooting live or recording it, and then afterwards they make snazzy video edits and they use that in propaganda. So that's a big part of it.
That's crazy that there are people out there that will go on a mass shooting so they can like supercut it.
Well, I don't know if they're actually well, they probably are, honestly, because they're at this point when they've been convinced to do this, they're gone. But a lot of times I think it's important to note that we talked about how accelerationists infiltrate certain movements and target people. They might be secretly targeting somebody where instead of, like, for example, Peyton Gendron, who wrote a manifesto about accelerationism, you might actually have them targeting like an LGBT community and trying to find that one trans person who's already really close to the edge and pushing that person closer and closer. Maybe you're even assisting them in buying guns. Maybe you're assisting them in figuring out how to plan their shooting. And so an accelerationist might do that while also kind of disguising their intentions as being whatever ideology the hopeful shooter would have, whether that would be, maybe they're a white nationalist, or maybe it's like an anti-Semitic thing, or maybe they're a trans person who's just fed up, with all the stuff that they've been fed, right? So they can provoke people in an individualized way. It doesn't necessarily have to be like the shooter knew what they were doing would benefit this kind of radical cause.
So when you started, what was the first kind of story that got you going? Because this is not your normal career. This is not something that
I don't even get paid for this, man.
Supporter work. You did not go to school for this. This is not something that I'm going to dedicate my life to. You just kind of became this investigative journalist that pulls on maybe the darkest threads of the internet. How did you get there?
I've been an private investigator for a long time too, as like a side job. So I have that like in addition to my day job. I think I've been a licensed private investigator for 7 years or so. So it's been a while. I started doing, so I'm a ex-competitive shooter. And so I used to shoot guns, at a professional level. And I was a handgun instructor and a self-defense instructor that focused on women's self-defense for a really long time. But as I kind of started going onto the internet more and venturing around and like looking around and going, there's a lot of dangers online that we're not considering, right? Because I'm very good at helping people get their physical defense situated. But what about our online defense, you're teaching your kids how to avoid talking to strangers in white vans, right, on the street. But are we talking to our kids about avoiding those same strangers on the internet? And so my investigation started gearing more towards online defense and child advocacy and trying to protect our kids from these dangers, because not only are there pedophile networks and exploitation networks, but there's also people trying to groom your kid to be a mass shooter, as if we didn't already have enough to worry about, you know? And so I kind of started down that path. And then I really started to research these mass shootings very, very deeply. And so if I guess for probably about the last 2.5, 3 years, I've been really deeply investigating this world of online harms, really dark online harms.
And the first one that I watched you talk about started from Where's Jade? Mm-hmm. Which was the person that was associated with responsible for the pipe bombs on January 6th.
Well, she claimed to know who that person was, and then she went missing for a while. So in that video kind of explains how I got into all of this too, right? I was looking into these mass shootings and trying to figure out what was provoking these kids to go do it, because I was sure that there were shadowy provocateurs behind the scenes helping these kids plan. How do these kids get all these guns? How do they figure all this stuff out, right? Nothing could convince me after some of the things I'd seen that these were just lone wolf attacks where the kids are just completely self-radicalized doing all this on their own. I didn't believe it. And that's not what I'd seen. I had seen, for example, a shadowy provocateur who was talking to Peyton Gendron and giving him advice on what kind of guns to buy and where to buy them. And so these are the kind of things that I was like, okay, I want to look more at this, because if we're going to blame guns, if we're going to blame racism, if we're going to blame all of these things for mass shootings, shouldn't we be looking at the influences that these people are having, right? And what are the commonalities between all of these shooters? And what I started to notice was that all of these kids are, well, I say kids, but some of them are just young men, right? In their early 20s, but most of them are young. They're young, they're terminally online, right? Some of them are neurodivergent, autistic kind of, mentally ill. These are the type of people that are being targeted. Our most vulnerable youth are being targeted online by predators who want them to go commit a terror attack. And to me, it's really important that people understand that there's more to this mass shooting problem than just what the media is telling us, because the media hasn't been talking about this. They would never mention this stuff. And it's funny because about 2.5 years ago, when I started talking about this, I was called crazy. I mean, I had people from all corners of the internet, big influencers coming and attacking me and mass reporting my YouTube and calling me like a conspiracy theorist. And what's funny is that now we're not only seeing like people come around, but like the news is reporting on it. The DOJ is putting it in their press releases. We've got counterterrorism communities that are picking it up and writing reports. So I wasn't crazy. I was just early. You know, people weren't ready to accept this yet, but I think they are now. They're starting to understand that there's a shadowy hand behind the scene that's, you know, influencing some of these kids.